Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good break. You probably needed to do other assignments after having finished my one. But nonetheless, I hope you had a good long weekend. So this is the second last lecture for this module of Ling 2. Today we're going to be looking at second language teaching methodologies. And I'll relate that to what we call instructed SLA as well. And then just to highlight tomorrow, some of you might have seen me editing the slides for tomorrow's lecture, which I'm working on. That's going to be about the future of SLA. It's kind of very much kind of forward thinking, trying to imagine what SLA will be in 50 to 100 years. If indeed people will still be researching this, it might be irrelevant. Anyway, so that's for tomorrow. I'm also going to be doing a briefing on the exam tomorrow. So just about what kind of things you would need to focus on as you prepare, just to kind of highlight a few things that you'd want to know. But yeah, today, and some of what we're going to look through has been mentioned as we've gone through the course. You will, for instance, I think there was a question in one of the quizzes about the audiolingual method, communicative language approach as well, which we'll see now. So all of what we've learned is very relevant for this because this is the application of SLA in some sense. And I know for some of you who are going to be teachers, there's a lot of relevance to looking at the more applied side of SLA. For those of you who are not, you've all had experiences of having been taught probably by others in your second or third language. So I just invite you to, as we go through this, to think about all these methodologies or approaches that we look at in relation to your own experience of being taught. Okay, so just as introduction, I'm sure even at least within my memory, there was a shift from outcomes-based education to the CAPS curriculum. I'm not sure, probably all of you experienced CAPS, but there's always shifts in educational philosophy and in curricula. And I mean, that's the case in education, it's the case in academia, and certainly it's been the case in language teaching. So frequent shifts, there's trends, there's fads. Often, or at least this kind of developed within the educational literature, distinctions between an approach to something, a method of something, and a technique of something. And approach is usually the higher level. The methods are the methods that you'd use within a certain approach, and each method would have maybe one or more techniques. So you can kind of see how it works. But anyway, all of those things will affect a learner's acquisition of a language and sometimes impede it. So it very much depends on what kind of approach are you following, what methods within that approach, and then what specific techniques are you using as a teacher to help foster acquisition in students. Yeah, I think a lot of teachers lack historical awareness of how the profession has developed. I mean, many teachers, particularly if you maybe in the foundation phase here in South Africa, you'd be teaching all subjects. But for those who are specifically language teachers, they don't really have a sense of how the methodology or pedagogy that they're employing as they teach has developed and how other people have tried things previously. And kind of history repeats itself, as you'll see, just with slight variance over time. Yeah, so it's useful just for critically kind of understanding, evaluating new methodologies that come around. So just quickly, a terminological discussion is the difference between instructed SLA and then also language teaching methodology or language teaching, second language teaching. So SLA that's instructed focuses on the impact of what formal instruction does, right? So it's focusing on the acquisition, but then if you add into the mix, so I mean, obviously for a lot of people, acquisition takes place outside of formal educational contexts. But then if you are being formally instructed in a language, how does that affect your acquisition? So that's the primary overall kind of interest of instructed SLA. So I mean, that's looking at the methods that you might use, for instance, TPR or total physical response, which you'll see now. The materials that learners use, whether dictionaries, textbooks, audiovisual media, whatever it might be, and then also the environments that they are in. So often it's a classroom environment, maybe even a lecture environment. It's not ideal for language teaching. But then also things like study abroad. It's very much coming out of the European and American, I guess, paradigm of SLA, and where they look at students who move to a different country in order to learn a language better, and all the kind of how acquisition works in those contexts when they are being taught probably in a classroom where they have a first language teacher, which might be different from back home, someone who learns it as a second language is teaching it. So all these kinds of factors are very interesting from the perspective of instructed SLA. So yeah, and I think it's mostly kind of researchers who are interested in this. I didn't want to just focus on things that are research focused only within this module as I went through it. So that's why I'm kind of at the end, I'm trying to add on something that's very applied. Okay, so to distinguish then instructed SLA from second language teaching, or second language teaching methodology. Often when you're talking about teaching, you're talking about the methodologies that you'd be using. So that's the practical application of SLA knowledge, so what we've looked at in this module, as well as then understanding what the impact of your instruction is. So it's taking those two things, the kind of more general SLA knowledge, as well as the knowledge that comes from instructed SLA, and then figuring out, well, how can I best teach as a result of that? So it's kind of looking for best practices, for theories of teaching, methods, obviously approaches, techniques, all those various levels of what you need to do. Yeah, and I mean, the goal then of second language teaching, obviously to get learners to learn a language, right? And also to develop relevant skills. In some classrooms or in some instructed contexts, not all skills are the aim. For instance, if you go to Bible school or theology or kind of a religious institution where you'd be taught to be a religious leader, you're probably going to be focusing on the more reading and writing and maybe speaking elements. So in some language instruction contexts, it's very dependent on what the function of language will be for those people. But I mean, in terms of those who study it, so you might do something like this in the education department, faculty, I'm not sure what it is here. You know, designing the process of designing lessons, selecting materials, the actual implementation of teaching methods, and then also, obviously, one thing that's important in second language teaching is assessment. Not always, it depends on the methodology and also depends on the kind of school. I think for most people, assessment is a very normal part of your academic experience. But in some cases, I think, for instance, yeah, there's more alternative education practices like Waldorf schools and Montessori, and they're not as interested in assessment. Okay, so there's just an example. So as we now discuss, I'm focusing now on the second thing, not on instructed SLA. If I had more time, I would look at that. We've already seen elements of that coming through. For instance, when we were talking about the interactionist approach and what would be the negotiation of meaning and task-based language teaching, that's something we will look at. Often all those things go together because if people are doing tasks together, they're forced to interact. So kind of that's one way in which SLA proper interacts then with second language teaching. And at least within kind of the school system we have in South Africa and where a lot of the research has come from, it's also relevant to places in the Far East and elsewhere, but it's largely coming out of the Western tradition. And so there's been kind of all these fashions and fads in language teaching that have developed over time from, 2,000 years ago. Okay, so some of them will focus on using whatever you are learning and getting students to use something. So, and that's particularly the speaking and understanding side of things. Then the other focus is more like getting you to analyze language as you learn it, rather than so that you can use it. And we'll kind of see both of those emerge now as we look at, well, first we're going to look at some of the history of language teaching methodologies, but then also some of the more current ones. Okay, so back in the classical period, so this would have been, probably just over 2,000 years, 2,500 years ago. Well, mostly 2,000 years and onwards. The Greeks and the Latin, well, the Romans in particular, who used Latin as their language, because of those empires, there was a need for all the conquered peoples, and indeed the Greeks then, once they were conquered by the Romans, to then learn these languages. And so as a result of that, and that's typically why people learn languages, because there's some kind of socio-political change that occurs. In the case of South Africa, obviously classic example, post-colonial countries generally, there's a reason why people are learning different languages. It happens naturally as well with language contact when you're kind of at the border of people groups, so to speak, where different, like particularly in Europe and Asia, there's always been a history of different peoples who have kind of been on the edges of each other, and that's led to languages shifting and evolving. But in this case, this was largely because of conquest, because of the Romans conquering much of Europe and Asia as well. And so the teaching was largely informal and direct. So it was using oral techniques. So that's listening and speaking. It wasn't really relying on the written word, textbooks, things like that, largely because printing presses were not there. I think in China, almost 2,000 years ago, there had been a printing press, but I'm not sure if it then kind of, it didn't roll out. But at least within kind of the Mediterranean, Europe, that region, they had to write manuscripts by hand. So textbooks were not a feasible option for kind of rolling out language education. They did have also maybe some simple dictionaries as well. Again, handwritten, really expensive to make, takes a lot of time. Okay, so it was very informal. There was no kind of systems that people developed of language teaching, very much depending on who the teacher was, their personality, how they wanted to do it, and then also who the students were. And it was always very small scale as well. Typically, those who are richer would engage, would learn. Otherwise, it's happening purely informally, where by necessity you are learning it because perhaps you are a conquered people. The Romans have come in, and now because that's the language of power and of influence, there's a big incentive for you to learn it, right? But typically that would just happen by interactions, just in the informal way. So we're specifically talking about formal language instruction here as we're going through this. So that kind of applies to the so-called classical period and the medieval period. But then if we go to the Renaissance, which is starting in the 1300s and onwards, the printing press changed a lot of things because it enabled people to take language and also how language works for people who don't know and represent that on the page, and would allow people to kind of outsource language teaching to books in some way. So that's really when things started getting going. And partly because of literacy kind of exploding because of the printing press, then there was a shift that occurred in why people were learning languages, and also because Latin as a lingua franca was declining because it had broken up into all the various Latin-speaking peoples, became all the Romance languages as we know them today. So Portuguese, Spanish, French, kind of Romanian to some degree, and there's various other dialects of those as well, all derived from Latin. And people would speak that, but then if they went to school, if they were lucky enough to kind of learn, they would learn classical Latin. So it went more into a kind of an academic study mediated through books. So this is just an example of one person who kind of went against the trend. So what was happening, all the vernacular languages in Europe were then gaining prestige. So as a result, that old imperial language of Latin, which was used by kind of scholars, it wasn't really as something that people spoke anymore. So it became very much the preserve of the educated and maybe the wealthy, a way that you would signal that you are an educated person. And he developed a new approach. He was very interested in, I guess, more pragmatic or practical aspects of language learning and how it actually works best. And in his case, because he was forced to flee from his home country because of religious reasons, and throughout his life, he was a refugee in many different places. But he used Latin to communicate with all these people. So for him, the practical use of Latin was very high. And I think because he used it for people then who weren't using Latin in a practical way, but purely in an academic way, maybe they didn't really understand the importance of being able to speak a language as opposed to just reading and writing a language. And that's where he developed an approach which very much focused on inductive learning, not focusing on explicit grammar, just focusing on a very limited vocabulary at the beginning so that you aren't trying to learn like thousands and thousands of words, but you're focusing more on using that small vocabulary kind of core to do a lot of things, right? And then also using things like visual aids. So from a pedagogical perspective, I mean, sometimes mostly I'm just using text. I've got a picture of him here, but that's one way of engaging people's attention, of helping people to remember things. So he kind of pioneered this. This hadn't really been developed elsewhere yet. And very much he impacted later on. It's not as if people just decided he had good methods. No, the existing methods, which we'll look at now, continued for a long time, but people drew from him here and there. And I think now in the 20th century and 21st century, it's very interesting to look back in history and at his approach, which was quite prescient. Okay, so this is really, for a long time, was the main method. And indeed, some people who are still living today experience language teaching which used this method. So it's called the grammar translation method, or the GT method. And often I'm conflating both method and approach. So in other words, sometimes it's hard to define the boundary between an approach, which is quite general, and a method, which is a bit more specific. So don't be too concerned about that. You'll be hearing both approach and method. So this comes out of the teaching of classical languages, particularly within the European context. And it became dominant in the 1700s and 1800s. And the main way in which it happened was the mother tongue. So whatever your first language was, the medium of instruction, right? So that's the way you were instructed. It wasn't in the second language that you're learning, whether Latin, Greek, or any other languages. And you would spend a lot of time memorizing lists of grammar rules and vocabulary. So my dad, for instance, when he went to school, he learned some Latin, and this was the way that he did it. And I mean, he remembers, if you don't learn it in his day, at least he got beaten, right? So it's a very different kind of way. Like, you need to learn all your vocabulary items or you'll get beaten. So there's a focus on translation. And again, because these were so-called classical languages, they weren't being used, they weren't vernacular, you're focusing on taking ancient texts and understanding them, or converting your own vernacular speech into these ancient languages. So it's very translation focused, and that's reading and writing. And yeah, this focus on grammar, on vocabulary, and then really just translation, that sums up the grammar translation method. So, I mean, it's rote learning. It's not really focused on people understanding things. And so part of the reason my dad also got caned or beaten was because he just learned things on the list, he didn't understand anything. And then it also just leaves you with a lack of any practical communication skills. Again, partially because the method is not trying to achieve that, right? Okay, so that was then happening in the 1800s. And then we have something called the direct method that developed in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s, as a response. And it's trying to now make things more intuitive and conversational, and it applies first language acquisition logic to second language acquisition. So, for instance, so I guess the direct method is you directly go into your target language. You are not using any first language content. And maybe some of you have experienced attempts at this in the classroom where the teacher refuses to engage with anyone in the first language. So this was a very trendy way of teaching for quite a long time. People thought this was the way that you would learn quickest and is the least difficult way of learning. So grammar is taught implicitly. You're not spending a long time kind of laying out the grammar rules because maybe you can't even understand that, right? If it's all being explained in the target language and you haven't reached the proficiency that's sufficient to understand very complex grammatical discussions, right? So it was only effective for a small number of people who are highly motivated, and that's pretty hard to find. I think before mass education and the democratization of education, maybe the people who were learning were more motivated but at least in large school classrooms, it's very, very difficult to do something like this because everyone has different learning styles, cognitive styles. Some people are just not motivated enough and going to Krashen, like a lot of that input is just not going to be comprehensible for people, right? So the direct method has some serious issues. Then as a response to some degree to that, this then emerged. So, the direct method was pretty popular at the beginning of the 1900s. Then things started to move. Also, as technology moved, we started having technology that allowed people to make recordings of sounds and language. So record players, tapes, things like that. And the audiolingual method developed. And you've obviously encountered a more behaviorist approach to SLA. This is very much based in that same time period. So it makes sense then that the theory of SLA would find its expression in the teaching practices of people. So, it's habit formation. That's what we're all about. As a teacher, we just want to instill habits of language into students. So there's lots of repetition, drills. You are wanting students to avoid errors like the plague. You don't want them to be making errors because each time they say it, it might instill that error as a habit, right? So you've got to avoid errors. You'd focus on grammar. So there's an interesting link here with Jan Comenius' approach. So it's about the structures rather than expanding the vocabulary, because again, grammar is language habits. The specific words you use, those are interchangeable. And then things like the use of language labs. Obviously, if now, and the way this worked is you'd go into a language lab and you'd kind of put some earphones over your ears and you'd just be hearing. I was trying to find a clip so that we could listen to an example of this method. There's something called Pimsleur. If any of you are interested, I'm sure you can go on YouTube and hear some of how Pimsleur works, but you'd hear your own language that you know, or English typically. And then, so like, I want to go to the shops. And then you would hear then the target language right after that. Maybe it's repeated twice. And then what you are supposed to do as a learner is that you would then repeat after, you'd repeat the target language utterance. And that's how you would get into the habit of speaking. And while that's happening, you are supposed to be inferring all the language rules. Okay, so the criticism, and this is just borne out in how people learn. Some people who can pick up auditory information very well and remember kind of song lyrics, those kind of people will do well by this method, but that's not everyone at all. And so like just doing drills doesn't mean that you're going to infer the actual structure and grammar of language and then be able to produce it if you're just saying things. You can go through the motions, but that doesn't mean that you end up actually developing skill. And yeah, just behaviorist theory doesn't quite explain how SLA works. So it's when then applied to something like language teaching, it actually can get in the way and almost waste learners' time rather than help them develop skill. So kind of from the 1950s onwards, obviously the educational world is growing. There's all sorts of theories in psychology. There's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas going on. Some people started to think, well, the physical movements, for instance, you will have noticed that I use my hands a lot when I'm lecturing. And there's something about that I'm trying to communicate when I use my hands. And so the idea was, well, when we are teaching a language, let's use people's bodies to help reinforce their learning in some way. So it was developed by a guy called James Asher. And you're encouraged to respond physically to verbal commands. So, if a teacher says, okay, everyone stand up, maybe in the target language, and to maybe you need to then respond. So as he says, stand up, then everyone in the class says, we are standing up as they are standing up, right? In the target language. So I would call that something like a memory hook, right? When you almost develop muscle memory that then is related to your mental memory of words. It focuses very much on you being able to comprehend the language and then respond physically to it, whatever the meaning is, not so much on being able to produce it. So it's ideal, and this is a criticism, it's effective for beginners, but it's pretty limited for advanced learners. Once you start getting to really abstract concepts like, okay, love, maybe you could do a heart and things like that, but personality, trying to explain personality through some physical kind of response, it just doesn't work once you get to more abstract levels of language. So that's one kind of idea that was very influential, particularly in beginner stages of language teaching. You'll still find it today. Then later, so probably from the 70s and 80s, this really started to gain steam, particularly as the behaviorist approach lost all its steam and people weren't too interested in that anymore. Communication became the focus, and there was a move back towards communication, communicatively embedded input, all of these kinds of concepts. Crashing came around, the more interactionist side of things, sociocultural theory. And I'd say it's an approach rather than a specific methodology. So we'll see some examples now, which you will recognize. But the key features, it prioritizes meaningful communication. Grammatical accuracy is secondary to achieving communication, right? According to this approach. It uses real-life scenarios and tasks to teach language skills and encourages interaction, right? So group work, role-playing tasks. But some people would say, well, you are prioritizing communication at the expense of then accuracy. And if people are just learning to communicate, all the rich heritage of a language, the way that people should speak, so it's very much language purists who would make this critique. They'd say, well, this is not helping develop people into good speakers of the language. They just can achieve communication objectives, but there should be more when you're teaching a language. Okay, so I probably should say methodology here rather than approach, apologies, is somewhat similar to the direct method which we just looked at, but you'll recognize that it's usually something like this is traced back to Krashen, and it tends to be quite innatist or view second language learning as mirroring the development of a first language. So some of the key features then is it's all about listening. As a baby would listen to parents and caregivers and develop language from that, that's where you as a second language learner will focus. You'll listen, you're encouraged to listen from your teacher. And like a baby, there's a silent period where before you start producing language, you are just taking things in. There's intake, and maybe you're giving non-verbal responses, so like total physical response, where you understand whatever the other person has said by virtue of how you respond physically. And that's the way that you would interact and engage with language for the initial period. But then only once you are naturally ready to speak, then do you actually start speaking. So there's no kind of pressure on you. Again, input just beyond the current ability. You'll recognize this from Krashen. And this is the way then that when you're developing teaching materials and tasks and things that children or learners would do, not just children, but adults as well, you'd always try and kind of keep to something that's in their ZPD or just beyond what they are able to do. The whole rule learning, grammar learning thing is very much kind of not in focus. And error correction, you're not too concerned about that, because again, this is very much coming out of Krashen's theory, acquisition and learning distinction. If you are actively kind of correcting, that's very different. That's just contributing to a learner's monitor, not to their actual acquisition. Rather let them intuitively work out their own errors and kind of figure out how to speak correctly. Yeah, and I guess a focus on authentic language. They don't want classroom-based language activities and exercises. It's the language as it's actually used out in the world, and they try and import the world back into the classroom. So that's what the comprehension-based approach would look like. There's probably other names for this as well. But again, I mean, people would criticize and say, well, there's too much passive learning going on here. And then it's very dependent on quality input. And if a teacher isn't providing that, then maybe this is actually causing more trouble and would create, for instance, demotivation in learners if they're just not understanding, right? So this could be a very bad methodology to follow. And, you know, some learners are geared cognitively to want to understand rules in an explicit way. They don't want to just by inference or kind of induction figure out what the rules are for a language. Okay, so that's one kind of communicative language approach. Another one, this is more focusing on the unit of teaching. And as we'll see now, so it evolved from CLT, but it focuses on tasks as the opportunities for interaction, negotiation of meaning, all these various things, and moving away kind of from language drills. So very much within the grammar translation method, even in the direct method, you would be drilling, just be kind of either repeating it or you'd be writing things out. In this case, it's all about little bits of interaction that a teacher would then kind of make a module or just put into a task. They would kind of work out how the task would go, and then that would be the opportunity for language learning around the interaction in that task. So yeah, a nice way of saying it, it's the core unit of pedagogical relevance. Learners need to solve some problems, and they need to use language to achieve that. So it's very kind of functional focused. And so they're not focusing on correcting errors in the same way. So you can kind of see there's some similarities with the comprehension-based methodology that we just looked at. The grammar is a tool, and it is taught. So there is a focus on form of how the grammar works, but it's more so that you can actually use that to achieve whatever the goal of the task is. But yeah, it takes a lot of time to work something out like this. So it's very ideal, but in practice, often the time required for very busy teachers just leads to this being implemented in bad ways. So yeah, and also the second point, criticism there, kind of applies to many of the other more communicative ones as well, where so much of modern academics, whether at school or here, is based on assessment, as you well know. And so if you're focusing on getting people to communicate in class and focus on that, it's very difficult to measure the product of that kind of interaction and kind of get that on a page, give it a mark. Maybe you can, do some observation as one way where you would then assign, well, they managed to achieve their goal in this task well. But still, that's very subjective for the teacher. So it's hard to kind of roll that out across a whole bunch of students and get a fair mark that would actually, that isn't then based on maybe how the teacher feels towards certain students. So it's very difficult to assess this kind of language teaching methodology, which is part of the reason why people don't do it. They prefer the ones which are much easier to assess. But then sometimes that's very bad for language learning. So two more, which I'll go into just very briefly, which are a bit newer. So the first is computer-assisted language learning. It feels actually old now, even just saying that, because obviously not everything that happens with digital technology now is centered around a computer. We have smartphones now. Things are different. We'll look at that tomorrow in the next lecture. But this kind of developed, particularly in the 90s and onwards, as computers were becoming more available. Still very present today. I'm not sure if any of you have had experiences of using computers maybe to help with language learning. Very much depends on what like the latest app is or the latest system for the computer assisting. Various schools will kind of buy some software and then roll it out, and then it kind of half works. So that's another methodology where the computer or some kind of computer adjacent device is the mediator for learning. You'd be playing a game. That's a language learning game, for instance. Yeah, so and I think this is developing probably into something which you could call artificial intelligence assisted language learning. That's my own term. I'm sure other people have been talking about this now. I haven't really been looking out at the conversation around language learning in relation to AI, but I'm sure something like this has been spoken about, and we'll chat about that more tomorrow. So another which this has been implemented in a few places, but is really difficult to implement, called content and language integrated learning. There's a few other, you could also see content-based instruction. But what it does is, and it's pretty complex because it requires you to take a subject and all that subject knowledge and then find ways of integrating language learning into that. So for instance, to be honest, that would be ideal for the South African education system at large, given the fact that English is like the first language of maybe only 10% of the population. But it's to try and achieve dual competence in the languages. So you learn how to express content knowledge in both languages. But what that does do is a bit difficult, is that obviously there's less time that you can spend on content knowledge if you're talking about grammar and how to express things in two different languages. So there's always pros and cons to all of these methods. Like if you prioritize one thing, it's at the expense of others within the classroom context where there's limited time. So yeah, complex to get right. Teacher training is crucial. I mean, if a teacher, for instance, is not able to actually, they don't have the competence in both languages like they should, almost certainly the students would also suffer as a result. So that's kind of a snapshot of, through time, various language teaching methodologies that have emerged, and also some of the more recent ones. If you go to a language institute or language school, so outside of like universities and normal schools, public or private, they tend to use more communicative methodologies where they're focused on helping people speak and learn, but usually it's really just to a beginner or intermediary level. In more formal academic environments like here, so if you were taking some of in the School of Languages, there's always been a tendency to do the grammar translation method, partly because it arose, that kind of method came from academies, so it came from universities from a long time ago, back to the 1300s when universities, at least in the West, were getting started, which is where we inherit our education system from. So yeah, there's maybe what I'd like to suggest at the end, and some people have written and spoken about this, but just a post method or post methodology for language teaching, which just rejects trying to stick with total physical response or the direct method or task-based language instruction, any of these various kind of methodologies, and just says, well, we can pick and choose. You can draw from as many methodologies as you feel appropriate. And this is on the basis of learners' needs. How big is the class? Is it big or small? What is the context? What are the cultural considerations around how students interact with each other or how they interact with teachers? Some cases they might not feel comfortable interacting with teachers. So yeah, kind of this is I'm putting a question mark around it. I would also be cautious about this, though, because if you don't have some kind of theory of how you're supposed to teach, chances are you'll just do whatever you want. And when you do whatever you want, you often aren't really thinking about what's best for other people. Research and all the findings from like linguistics and SLA has actually said about the matter. So there definitely are best practices, and it's maybe a bit dangerous if you're just going to pick and choose. There are reasons that we have findings, and those should be implemented within applied language kind of practice. So in the case of teaching. Okay, so we're going to finish slightly early today. There's a tutorial on Friday with the quiz. It's based on last week's lecture and reading. So that was on bilingualism, trilingualism, and the reading. And then also this lecture. There's no reading for this week, you'll be pleased to hear. And then tomorrow in the Dorney, there's going to be an exam briefing, and then kind of like at least for me, as I was saying, an interesting lecture, trying to think through, well, what is SLA? Everything that we've been discussing for this term, how relevant is this for the future? What does it mean to learn a language in the age of AI? So that's what we'll be looking about tomorrow, and that's all. I'll see you tomorrow.